People think they want the truth. They always say they hate being lied to, but often when reality reveals itself, it troubles people to such an extent that they probably should have stayed in the nice cozy darkness that was ignorance. Because as they say, you can't handle the truth. These are 15 historical facts that will disturb you. Number 1. Vlad the Impaler. If you are not familiar with this legendary leader, you may not know the legend that he inspired, because he's the man who unintentionally created the legend of Dracula. In fact, his name in certain circles was Vlad Dracula, which means spawn of the devil. So what made him so terrifying? There were a lot of things, which included the whole impaling thing that I'll get to later. But first, he was a vicious ruler that was not afraid to play dirty and do heinous things to people who didn't pay him any respect, or who had tried to take his land. He once even nailed hats to people's heads because they refused to take them off. He invited people to his castle, and then would kill them all to ensure that he had sole power over his nation. And finally, and perhaps most terrifyingly, when he wanted to make an example out of an enemy, he would stick a pole into them from a certain orifice in their backside, and then stand that pole upright so that their bodies would slide down the pole. It was brutal and painful, and that's how he got the name Vlad the Impaler. By the end of his reign, it was stated that he had killed over 80,000 people, so yes, he was quite the monster. Now it's time for the sweet topic. The history of women's bathing suits is far more dark than you think. Most of it is due to the unpleasant and controlling behavior of a small subset of toxic men. From the 18th century to the modern day, women's swimsuits have dynamically changed, significantly more than any other item of clothing. And the history almost works as a perfect parallel of women's rights and liberation. While once upon a time they covered most of the woman's body, with each passing decade more and more varieties have been introduced that were more revealing. This was because, once upon a time, men had deemed it illegal for women to be scantily clad in public, but as time passed on, and women gained more rights to express themselves in the way that they wished, the highly restrictive limitations of women's bathing suits hugely changed. These days, a woman can wear what she wants on the beach, and quite right. As always, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below using the hashtag #SweetTopic. Number 3. Witch trials. When you hear the term witch trials, you may often think about the Salem witch trials that took place in the early days of the United States. But the truth is, they actually go back to the 1400s. Now mind you, they weren't any more kind the farther that you went back, and you could argue that they were even worse in some ways. Regardless of the period, the courts were a joke. I mean, after all, how could you reasonably test if a person's a witch? But even if they did pass the test, who's to say that people won't just say it's a trick and have them killed anyway? Sadly, that kind of madness is what led to 100,000 people being accused and potentially killed for their so-called crimes. And as we know now, there are no such things as witches, and all those people died for nothing. Further showing that humanity can be cruel when it lashes out against something that it simply doesn't understand. Number 4. The Great Molasses Flood. Now, despite it sounding hilarious, it was a very real thing that happened. I promise you that. In fact, it happened just over 100 years ago in Boston, Massachusetts. A large storage tank that was filled with 8,700 cubic meters of molasses, weighing approximately 12,000 metric tons, burst open, and the resultant wave of molasses would rush through the streets at an estimated 56 kilometers per hour, killing 21 people and injuring 150 others. As we would later find out, various conditions, including the weather and temperature, led to the bursting of that tank and the molasses pouring out. As for how the people died, well, that's a lot of molasses. And since it's thicker than water, people did not know how to try and swim through it. Here's a fun fact: the flood was actually mentioned during an episode of Mythbusters where they tested whether swimming in syrup was as easy as swimming in water. Number 5. Foot binding. If we want to talk immediately about this disturbing topic, we should note right off the bat that both in ancient times, as well as the modern ones, people have been willing to go to extreme lengths to try and make their bodies more beautiful, and both then and now, the results have been disastrous at times. In ancient times, however, they did do various things to enhance the female body that, frankly, make absolutely no sense. For example, in China, there is the art of foot binding, where the goal was to tie up a young girl or woman's feet with special shoes so that it could be altered the shape of their feet and by extension the rest of their body. The goal, as noted, was to make the girl or woman more beautiful. At one point, having these kinds of foot bindings was a status symbol for beauty, but the darker truth was clear to the women who had to deal with the process. First, it was incredibly painful, and that also meant they had to suffer for society. Secondly, the woman who had their feet changed often had disabilities throughout their lives thanks to the process. And if you want to know what's even more disturbing, this practice began hundreds of years ago and didn't stop until the 20th century. There are even women who are alive today who suffered because of foot binding. Number 6. Egyptian slavery. Depending on your religion, you might know all about the slave trade that went on in ancient Egypt. It was brutal and cruel and wrong, but what may shock you the most was how far the owners of the slaves were willing to go to humiliate them while protecting themselves. Apparently, in 2300 BC, King Pepe II had a practice to ensure that he wouldn't get swarmed by flies. He would cover his slaves in honey, all so that the flies would be attracted to them and not him. Number 7. Dentures. Teeth care has been something that not all of humanity has taken very seriously, and we're not even talking about places like third world countries where healthcare options are limited. There are plenty of people in lavish nations that don't always take care of their teeth, but in ancient times it was even worse because of the lack of caring, products, or understanding about why you needed to have good teeth. The irony is that, despite the lack of proper dentists, there were things like dentures back then, and by the 18th century dentistry had begun to take off. And there were plenty of people who were up for having things like dentures to replace the teeth they had lost. The carved ivory denture, full set, top and bottom. Overall, it's not really a bad thing, but as you could guess, it does come with a catch. The catch in this case is that many dentures from those eras were made from the teeth of dead people. For example, in France, at a key point in history, the soldiers who died at Waterloo actually had their teeth ripped out so that dentures for others could be made. And thus, we should get on our knees and thank whatever higher power is out there that we don't have to worry about having that happen these days. Number 8. Alexander the Great's death. This one is going to get a little morbid, and I didn't mean for that to happen. Sticking with the positive for a moment, Alexander the Great was one of the greatest figures in history. He was the one who conquered the world and helped to create many architectural things that we still use today, which includes the roads between certain nations. It was through him that the Greek taught us multiple cultures and led to the understanding of other languages, which includes through things like the Rosetta Stone. That says nothing of his military prowess. In fact, he was such a genius on the battlefield that he rarely, if ever, lost a straight-up fight. And even when he felt that he couldn't win a battle head-on, he would use some clever tactics to instill fear into his foes, or to make it seem like his forces were more than the enemy thought. However, not unlike certain other figures in history, his death is a bit mysterious. Most would agree that he didn't die in battle, but he died because of an illness, something that is a bit ironic given how strong he was through the course of his life. But no one could say exactly what kind of disease it was, and thus this true cause of death was a mystery. However, more recent studies do seem to indicate that he was killed by two things. First, being disease, which many believed paralyzed him to the point of him not being able to move, and two, that he was actually buried alive. According to these new insights, his paralysis was so complete that doctors couldn't even tell if he was still breathing. Now remember, at that time, medicine wasn't even close to what we have now. So it wouldn't be all that difficult to fool someone into thinking that you had stopped breathing when instead, you're just laying there really still. And what do you do with someone who has apparently died? Well, you bury them, of course, and they might have literally buried this legend alive. And so, he died by his own men's hands. It is a truly grisly thought. Number 9. Predicting the Titanic. Throughout history, there are examples of oracles and certain events that predicted things that would happen later on in life. But did you know that there was a story that came out 14 years before the Titanic sank that predicted the demise of the ship? As we all know, the Titanic was built to be unsinkable, but a series of events led to that statement being proven false. Not the least of which was the vessel hitting an iceberg that caused a lot of damage to the soon-to-be sunken ship. Enter Futility, the Wreck of the Titan, published by the US writer Morgan Robertson. This novel tells the story of the world's largest passenger ship, the Titan, and how it sank after hitting an iceberg. And again, it was published 14 years before the actual event. This is one of those things where you can't help but shake your head and say, really? Well, yes, it did happen. And the fact that the ship in the book was called Titan, and the ship that sank 14 years later was Titanic, and they both hit an iceberg, well, that definitely will give you pause. Sometimes history can just be weird in the connections that it makes. Number 10. She birthed what? Now, history is full of tales of the things that women have birthed, and many monster tales have been born as a result. Back in the 18th century, there was a woman who, somehow, convinced doctors that she was giving birth to rabbits. I'm not making it up. The story goes that she went on to give birth to 20 rabbits, all of whom came out of her womb dead. This would get the attention of the king and many others who wanted to find out what was going on. Eventually, after a whole lot of tests and some confessions, it was revealed to be a hoax. Why someone would go to such lengths to commit such a hoax is well beyond me. Number 11. Thomas Edison's doll history has recently changed its perspective on Thomas Edison. At one point in time, he was credited as the greatest inventor ever, but as we would find out, there was a bit more to this story. Not the least of which is that he simply hired people to make inventions and then took all of the credit for himself, which included stealing from Nikola Tesla. However, he did have insight into something that would be popular later on, as he had tried to create a line of dolls that didn't only look a certain way, but could also talk and sing. He was successful in crafting them, but they were hardly a hit. In fact, they were so expensive that many couldn't even afford to buy them. And if you look at them, they are also pretty well creepy. Number 12. King Tutankhamun's parents. The finding of King Tut's tomb is easily one of the most important archaeological discoveries in the history of the world. Because of it, humanity felt an urge to learn more about Egyptian culture, its history, and the history of other ancient empires across the world. However, while his find was important, we still don't know a whole lot about the young pharaoh. In fact, there are mysteries about him, his reign, his family, and more, that people are still trying to figure out. But one rather creepy answer to one of those questions may have been found. While we do have official confirmation on who his father was, who preceded Tut in the rule of Egypt in the 14th century BC, his mother was more of a mystery. However, after some DNA testing, researchers now believe that King Tut's mother may have actually been his aunt. That's right, his father might have married and slept with his own sister, which is a practice that we know happened in Egypt quite a bit. Number 13. Zombie apocalypse in Europe. That probably got your attention because zombies are very much a modern-day thing. And you're probably asking yourself, zombies and the concept of them couldn't have existed in ancient times, right? Well, yes and no. No, there was not any undead walking the streets in ancient times, no matter how cool it may have been to think about certain possibilities with that. But yes, there were things like that likely looked like to those who were experiencing them. During the Italian Renaissance, people were doing all kinds of things to enjoy the enlightenment that they had been granted, and through that many wonderful things were born. However, during that period, another thing was born, and that was syphilis. In fact, in places like France and Italy, syphilis was so common that it affected a whole lot of people, and even got the name of super syphilis by some later on given how much it affected the body. And what does that have to do with zombies? One of the things syphilis can do is rot out your skin, especially on your face. So now, imagine a lot of people with syphilis in the streets without any kind of treatment, and you're seeing all of their wounds on their flesh, meaning that sometimes seeing the bones within their bodies. How would you choose to define that person in front of you? You may well endeavor to call them a zombie. Either way, this so-called zombie apocalypse was very real. An award between France and Italy only made the spread of syphilis worse. As a result, we still have it to this day, minus the zombie lookalikes, of course. Number 14. Qin Shi Huang's death. China will forever be a country that is talked about historically because it's been around through many parts of history and has forged its own path through it. Between its armies, the wars, its technology, its philosophy, and of course, the way that its government has been run. Simply put, China has become something that you can't help but talk about. However, once upon a time, there was not a unified China. Instead, there were just a bunch of warring states that created their own dynasties until another group came around and took them down. Enter the first emperor of China, a man and ruler who unified China and thus became its first emperor. Now, you likely know of the emperor not only for his act of bringing China together, but for his infamous tomb, which houses the legendary terracotta army, a remnant of history that is still talked about and researched to this day. But something that is rather disturbing about his life is actually how he died. Because while he accomplished much in his life, he was also a man who didn't want his life to end. That's right, much like many other people before him, the emperor had his followers try and find him the elixir of life so that he could be immortal. And we do have proof of this, as people have recovered letters from the emperor to his regional governors, ordering them to find something to extend his life. For 2,000 years, all we had was, when things didn't pan out the way he wanted them to, that's when he decided to drink certain concoctions to extend his life. One of them being mercury. Yes, in the ancient times there were plenty of people who actually thought that mercury was a healing liquid. Instead, it's a very poisonous one for the body. And as a result, he died at the age of 39. Many would agree that it was the poisonous liquid that had made him die so young. And one can only wonder what may have happened had he simply focused on living his life, versus fearing his own death. Number 15. Radium Girls. One of the drawbacks of not knowing everything about the planet is that you often don't understand how dangerous everything is until it's just too late. When radium was discovered, people marveled at their ability to have it do things like glow in the dark, and so naturally, they began using it to coat their various products. That also included working women who were given the job of painting watches with radium to make them glow. They were even told to sharpen certain parts with their teeth, thus they got radium in their bodies. They casually put it on themselves to make themselves glow because they never knew the truth. Years later, and most of the workers suffered terrible radiation-related ailments like decaying teeth, crumbling bones, and spines that crushed under their own weight. Turns out it wasn't such a fun job after all, I would say. And that's all from the realms of history and the facts that you don't often get to hear about it. Were you indeed disturbed by the facts that were revealed? Which ones were the most disturbing in your mind? Perhaps you feel there's another, even more disturbing history fact out there that we need to know about. You can let me know all of your thoughts in the comments section down below. Check out the other cool things that are showing up on the screen, and I will see you next time.